I want to make something quite clear before I address this issue. I am not saying that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is entirely going down the toilet. I'm not saying it's beginning to be of bad quality. I'm not saying that it's guaranteed to only get worse from here. I am not saying that I'm not looking forward to WandaVision. Far from it. The mere concept of the trailers and how bizarre it looks, it just entices my curiosity. It's kind of a similar reaction to like Detective Pikachu. It's a concept that's so bizarre that you just kind of have to watch it in order to get it. Now, I just wanted to address a few fears and concerns without the Marvel fanboying of my friend Neil. And I'm not saying Neil is incapable of being unbiased either, but I wanted to address something in regards to adapting, as well as the concern of things going on for a bit too long, things overstaying their welcome. My main concern is that there have been franchises before in the past, like The Simpsons, SpongeBob SquarePants, the Ice Age franchise, which is oddly enough on Disney Plus now, are all well-beloved franchises and critically acclaimed, but as the years went by, they've been critiqued for overstaying their welcome. You can tell from the quality of their storytelling that they're running out of ideas, and they should have stopped at a particular point. Not that all of their content is entirely wasteful. It's just that it probably would have been better if they stopped at a certain point. Like, the Ice Age franchise should have stopped at either Ice Age 3 or 4. Probably 4. Because people hated Ice Age 5. But, on the bright side, we are getting a new series about Buck, who is the best character in the franchise. Buck goes the weasel! I can respect The Simpsons for breaking Guinness World Records of the longest running show. And they'll always find a way to be relevant. But a lot of people state that The Simpsons is not as good as it used to be. Same for SpongeBob SquarePants. And that is my main concern with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. For those who've been living under a rock, with a pair of scissors. That's a little rock, paper, scissors joke for you there. Marvel is a comic book company, known particularly for making their empowering superhero stories. And fans have loved catching up with new adventures in long-running comic book series. I can remember having a similar passion for the UK Beano comics, but I'll get to that later. Marvel has had a few film adaptations over the years, and with a few exceptions, the vast majority of them tended to be pretty bad or mediocre. That was until around 2008, the same year that Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight came out, that Jon Favreau showed the world his take on Iron Man. At the end of Iron Man, there was Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury, promising a crossover. Now, crossovers were nothing new back in the day. We had films like Alien vs. Predator, Freddy vs. Jason, except those movies were also critically, panned. So in the following years, we then got The Incredible Hulk, we got Thor, we got Captain America, and then we got a crossover unlike any other crossovers. One that was actually good, and one that made many people go, "Whoa, that's awesome!" And the best part? It was promising even more. More sequels came out of these heroes, and more people started getting into it, including myself. And then it got so big it was considered the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And none of us had ever seen anything like it. They even reached out to heroes that people considered inferior and made them beloved, like Guardians of the Galaxy. Spider-Man, Hulk, and the Fantastic Four were no longer the main faces of Marvel. Now you got a whole variety of main faces associated with Marvel. Now you got Iron Man, you got Captain America, and Black Widow, and Hawkeye, and Thor, and Spider-Man, and the list goes on. They've had a few blunders here and there. Namely, the Iron Man sequels, Thor the Dark World, and Captain Marvel, which are considered the inferior Marvel movies. But even in their inferior movies in their collection, people still kept coming back and, to some capacity, enjoying them. Why? The characters were just so well developed. people kept coming back because they loved these characters so much. They were well written, they were well acted, they never felt forced. It was quite witty, and at times quite self-aware. These movies were fun, they were epic, they appealed to fans and critics, and it was a brilliant method on Hollywood's part to make a film franchise that's actually good. In fact, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was so influential that other people tried to copy off their success, namely DC and the Dark Universe? But they generally flopped, because they tried to rush in to cash into the success of what Marvel Cinematic Universe was trying to emulate. And because they rushed, their characters fell flat, and because their characters fell flat, they were critically panned. In fact, some people who tried to copy them were so confident in cashing into the success of the MCU that they would put a sticker of universe onto their film. The beginning of Tom Cruise's Mummy literally opens up with the Dark Universe. But I'm going off track. Some of the DC movies are actually quite good. So then came the sort of last phase. All the films were building up to this big villain named Thanos. And then the time came. Fun fact, when I heard that the filmmakers were heading to Scotland, me and a friend of mine were trying to get a casting call as aliens in the Infinity War. But none of us got it because college comes first. True story. Thanos was on a quest to collect all the Infinity Stones, which were hinted at throughout the various movies. Okay, not so much hinted, but directly shown and used. And for those who haven't seen Infinity War and Endgame, I don't think I'll bother spoiling it. The vast majority of you have probably already seen it anyway. To make a long story short, Thanos, the Infinity Stones, and this whole finale in general was epic. All the build-up was worth it. Everyone got super emotional of the fate of many characters. It was epic, it was fun, it was intense, it was emotional, and overall, a perfect finale to this whole Marvel Cinematic Universe. Even if some had already dropped off along the way, like my cousin Rebecca. And apart from a few films that have yet to be released, that kind of act as a cherry on top, like the Black Widow movie, which was meant to be released last year, and some kind of Spider-Man movie. Apart from those cherries on tops, whenever they come out, that story was just, wow, epic. They had a great build-up, and even though they had a few blunders, it all paid off tremendously. Honestly, I think Endgame is one of the most epic films ever, up there with Return of the King and Ben-Hur. It's that big. There's a reason why it broke box office records. So, what am I concerned about? Essentially, recent conventions and announcements have announced that Marvel is going to make more and keep expanding the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Do you really need to do that? Like, are you going to continue on from the story you've already completed? Now, to be fair, I'm going to look at both sides of the argument in this video. Because for any of you Lunatics fans, you'll know very well that my friend Neil is beyond excited for future Marvel Cinematic Universe content to be coming out. But my initial reaction to him saying that was literally, What do you mean,
What do you mean,
I don't like spam!
I don't like spam!
Spam.
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it!
I'm going to address both sides of the argument, and I'm very skeptical for the various reasons. The number one reason is to do with a problem with Hollywood in the first place. Martin Scorsese says that the Marvel Cinematic Universe isn't real cinema. Say what you want about his opinions there, but with these recent announcements, his opinions might become a bit of a reality, I'm afraid.
In Marvel films, these brief explorations of emotion are decoration for the ride of exciting action showpieces. If you can't see the difference, we'll have to agree to disagree, but I'd encourage you to expand your film palette and maybe explore more of what cinema has to offer outside of franchise movies. The Marvel films do occasionally go to some interesting places, and I'm not denying they hit some emotional beats very effectively, But in my opinion, the entire last decade of the MCU altogether has as much revelation and emotional risk as some individual movies.
And this is why character development is such an essential ingredient in a good story. We have to spend time getting to know believable characters and investing ourselves in their lives before they just get dumped in some exceptional conflict. This is why you'll often hear movie critics who didn't like a movie say things like, I didn't really care about the characters or what was happening to them. We have to care about them as if they were real people.
The reason why various of Disney's live action remakes don't work, because people have already had that emotional connection with the characters.
This is also why remakes and retellings of stories are ineffective in this way, because we've already invested ourselves, we're already familiar with those stories, and we've already gone through the experience of having compassion for those characters. So simply just retelling them doesn't produce the same experience the way that an original story does. This is why characters can't be mere accessories to some catastrophe or cosmic struggle, and why they can't be just mere implements of the author to provide exposition or to advance the plot forward.
They've already been through the story. They know what's going to happen. So through watching a duplication, they've kind of detached themselves unintentionally. Now, of course, there have been various remakes of A Christmas Carol, and people say that they love various versions of A Christmas Carol. And that is a valid argument. See, I told you I'd be weighing the opinions. And I was having a conversation with my friend Brooks, aka Squid Jedi. And I mentioned something about making good sequels, and at that moment I thought, ooh, that's actually one of my main concerns of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and where it's leading. I told Brooks, if you want to make a sequel, make sure you're making a story worth telling. From what I'm hearing from these announcements, I suspect that they're just literally going to give us the same story we've had from the previous phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Introduce a bunch of quirky superheroes, build up to some epic battle with a bad guy, and after a big struggle they eventually defeat the bad guy. I suspect it's going to be Galacticus. And sure, if handled right, it can be really epic. But we already poured out our emotions in a similar experience with Thanos. We've been there, we've done that. Does these next few phases offer anything new and exciting? Because if they're not, then they're just going to rinse and repeat the same thing. And that's exactly what Hollywood is doing, not just for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, mind you, but for a vast majority of film franchises, sorry, I didn't pronounce that correctly, like Transformers. They think, oh, well, people latched onto this experience in the past. Perhaps if we just recycle it over and over again, they'll just keep coming back for more. And yeah, somehow people do fall for that tactic. But over time, people are going to notice. It's also a similar complaint I would have with the Call of Duty video game franchise. No new ounces of creativity, no elements that make the whole creation process of making it worth it in the first place. No engaging story to help us, just the exact same routine. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, people, like my friend Neil, would say, "Ah, Callum, but it's only just getting started with the potential that it has, man. We're finally going to get these Marvel characters like She-Hulk. We might even get Fantastic Four in there." I suppose the concept of an actual good, literal Fantastic Four movie outside of The Incredibles does sound promising. And most of these stories are going to be in television shows. Again, these also have their pros and their cons. Although, to be fair, my friend Neil has been waiting for that Hawkeye show for far too long now. I'm sure the anticipation will be worth it for him. And I will give the Marvel fanatics credit. One of the methods of avoiding the sourness of rinse and repeat is to introduce new characters and new stories. That is, admittedly, an excellent tactic to get people coming back. And the format of these stories being in a television show, various television shows, they have their advantages and their disadvantages. Because with a television show, they have more time to develop characters. And if there's one thing that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is really good at, it's making a stretch story where they take time to develop characters over time. So making television series is a perfectly logical step for them. What's my problem? The fact that they're going to make the television shows absolutely necessary to watch to see the next big blockbuster movie. I think this is going to be a major slip up. Because you're telling me that I have to spend hours watching all these television shows in order to get the context of the next few movies. Whereas casual cinema goers who don't bother watching the television shows because they get convoluted will themselves get stuck with the dilemma of, who's this character? Who's that character? Oh, I'm meant to watch this television series? Okay. Oh wait, there's a reference to this other show? Oh, I need to watch that too. Oh, who, when, where, why? I have this concern that if this slip-up is going where I think it's going, this is going to become the new Kingdom Hearts in how convoluted it's going to get. And I mentioned casual cinema goers, because this is where I want to raise my concern about the issue of adaptation. I'm just going to say it bluntly now. What's going to work for a long-running comic book series may not necessarily work for cinematic movies. Now, I could be proven wrong, okay? After all, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has defied expectations in the past. But I think people need to understand the context of what makes comic books work and what makes films work. And I have insight into collecting comics because in my youth, I loved reading the Beano. If you read comic book series like the Beano or the Dandy, or in this case, DC or Marvel superhero comics, then you'll keep collecting more and more, and you'll be reading these stories about these heroes overcoming all odds, and there'll be stories that are kind of weekly. For the Beano, they had stories that were kind of like rinse and repeat, in a kind of Looney Tunes fashion, whereas I think the creators would take time to introduce more lore and more things like that. And most of the comics are just the characters clashing together to fight, with some bits of exposition here and there. Some of the comics are engaging and quite character-driven, although there are some big stories like The Secret Wars, where I must admit, it was kind of hard to get into the fighting and all the exposition, because they didn't take the time to explain why this war was so significant to begin with, prior to just leaping you into the action. Of course, I could be reading it wrong, and perhaps there were comics that were building up to that. But that's the thing, you'd have to be a comic book collector to get into that sort of thing. Now, with a film franchise, on the other hand, people have to work hard to bring the stuff to live action and stuff like that. And people go into these film franchises, like the Lord of the Rings trilogy or the Hunger Games trilogy. They usually come in trilogies. And even plenty of film franchises that undoubtedly last longer than 3 movies. Middle-earth Saga? People go into these, and they expect a beginning, middle, and end. They expect character development, they expect a conflict, they expect the empowerment, they expect to relate to these characters, and by the time the story is done, people will be satisfied to say, yes, the characters have reached the peak, and the conclusion is satisfying. And the audience, if they are rightly engaged, feel like they have grown up with the characters. The point is, people need closure in order to make a story satisfying. Kubo from Kubo and the Two Strings once said, all stories come to an end. It can be argued that there's some exceptions, but that's a discussion for another day. So, going back to what I said before, if you're going to make a sequel, make it a story worth telling. For example, a lot of people loved the first Rocky movie. I've heard some people say that Rocky 2 managed to ground his character. Thus it was a story worth telling. Or how about The Blues Brothers? The Blues Brothers is a fantastic comedy. But then there came a sequel in the year 2000, and it was not funny, and was quite frankly unnecessary. Thus, it was not a story worth making a sequel about. If I'm to give a little bit of a controversial stretch, Toy Story 4 was a story worth telling. Even though fans initially lashed out, why are you making another film for an already complete story? But whilst the film itself was not as good as Toy Story 3, Toy Story 4 told a surprisingly profound story about an existential crisis, and asking things about purpose. And because of that surprise, that made it a story worth making a sequel about. even though the Toy Story trilogy was already complete. Although I might be eating my own words here, because it may be that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is taking a Toy Story 4 approach, in that you don't have to see these movies and television shows. And to be fair, if I'm whining about the condition of Marvel, then I probably shouldn't bother watching any of their future content. But the point remains the same. If Marvel is going to continue on from an already complete finale, they had better make a story worth telling. They'd better have a good excuse for milking all the money out of my wallet. I just want to state here and now that it has been proven that the Marvel Studios, as a filmmaking studio, is fully capable of delivering a powerful, enticing, and satisfying definitive conclusion. If you don't believe me, you should watch Logan. Logan, in my eyes, is one of the best superhero movies ever. A lot of people say it's almost as good as The Dark Knight, in the way it twists its genres a wee bit. But there's another reason why people love Logan. Not just because it was gritty, not just because they saw a proper adaptation of like Old Man Logan doing brutally violent stuff. And not only was it emotional, not only were the characters well developed like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, not only was there conflict and drama, but the way it ended, it was a satisfying, conclusive ending for the character of Logan, aka Wolverine. There were questions like faith in the future generations, carrying on a legacy. And this finale was so good, even Deadpool got jealous over it. So he decided to die and enter the afterlife various times in his sequel. That says a lot about how impacting Logan is. And here's the thing, Logan was all the more impactful because it had an ending. Yeah, it's sad to see these characters go, but that's part of what makes it so powerful, combined with ending off on a high note, giving us hope to protect the future generations. That's what superheroes do. They give us hope. They help us see a better future. Ask yourselves this, are stories going to be impactful if they do not have a definitive conclusion that ends on a high note? Because I have seen some stories, especially television shows, that had a definitive beginning, middle, and end, and even though some fans would think, oh, I wish they could have continued, if you see the ways these shows are structured and serialized, if you look back at it and look at it as a whole, you'll think, yes, this is a satisfying conclusion, and everything that was building up to it made sense. The examples I can think of derive from Japan. One of them is Violet Evergarden. For fans of my channel, you'll know I'm in love with this series. As of recording this, I don't think they're making a season 2. The movie is going to conclude this series. But essentially, this series concentrated on character development. And there was not a single episode that felt like filler. Every episode felt important to the character's progress. And then it ended off on an emotional high note. I can think of another example. And fans of this show will definitely agree with me. Cowboy Bebop. There's a reason people call this show one of the best anime shows ever. This show has a definitive beginning, middle, and end, and a lot of people agree that the finale to this show is one of the most powerful finales ever. Yeah, I know some people can call this overrated, and I wouldn't expect everyone to enjoy this. But the very premise of this show makes the finale all the more satisfying. The show gets very philosophical, as these 4 main characters are all trying to run away from their past. And the way they grow is to confront their past to find closure. This leads to a bittersweet ending, and those infamous words, "You're gonna carry that weight." You'll have to experience the show in order to understand the full weight of it. On the other end of the spectrum, I've heard that One Piece is the longest running anime show that's been going on for more than 3 decades, yet fans are still engaged. Admittedly, I have yet to see One Piece, so I don't know if stretching this story for too long to the point where you question if it will ever end could actually work to their favor or not, I have no idea. But the point I'm making is that stories are often at their most powerful when they have a definitive conclusion that ends on a high note. Of course, not every show has to end off on a high note. Star Wars The Clone Wars ended off on a bleak note and it was really powerful. The point I'm trying to make here is that stories need to have a conclusion that has an impact. If Marvel is going to stretch out the story beyond the impactful film of Endgame, is Endgame really going to have an impact? Oh, sure. Characters died. And the actors who portray said characters are not intending to reprise their roles anytime soon. Thank God for consistency. But I want you all to think long and hard about this. Are these stories that Marvel is presenting, are they really worth telling in a cinematic format? What works for a long-running comic book sale is not going to work for the structure of a movie where people come in expecting a beginning, middle, and end. Is the leisure of getting a weekly comic and obtaining a hobby of reading them as a series with some cool action and exposition and stuff like that, is that going to translate well for the narrative structure of a cinematic franchise? And yeah, there are films like Fast and the Furious, which offer, like spontaneous action, stuff like that. But Fast and the Furious isn't focusing so much on narrative. The Marvel series is. And again, my main concern is that they're just going to rinse and repeat. Oh, introducing quirky characters. Big build-up towards a big fight with a villain. Despite the struggle, they attain victory. Yeah, we enjoyed that experience, but at this point, if you're not going to offer us anything new, or some kind of variety, then why should we bother with the Marvel Cinematic Universe anymore? We're better off just finishing with Endgame, because that is a well-rounded conclusion. And I'm not saying don't make more stories. I'm not saying stop making movies and television shows entirely. I think shows like WandaVision is going to work because they have a unique concept and they seem to have a narrative that's going to spark the fans' curiosity. Also ask yourselves this. Are the stories going to work well by their own merit? Imagine for a moment you have someone literally jumping into this Marvel Cinematic Universe. Jumping straight into WandaVision. No prior knowledge to any Marvel entertainment whatsoever. How are they going to view WandaVision? Is the quality of WandaVision highly dependent on knowing what happened in the events before? Can they enjoy WandaVision on its own merit? Are people going to enjoy other Marvel movies by their own merit? I know that seems unfair because the entertainment of most of these stories highly depends on our previous engagement with previous installments of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But it's becoming so big that if people jump in, they're going to get lost and confused. That's my main concern with tying in the television shows to the films. Because at least with shows like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Agent Carter, they weren't absolutely essential to the film franchise, but you could watch them anyway, as enjoyable stories in their own right. I remember going to America. I believe it was my first couple of days in New York, in a hotel. We watched an episode of Agent Carter. She and the butler, Jarvis, were spying on somebody. And even though me and Neely caught on to the little insights, we still enjoyed the story in its own right, as a sort of quirky spy thriller. And I know that making these television shows are guaranteed to get fans' attention because, Marvel. But I fear that a vast majority of people will never get the enjoyment of enjoying these films and movies by their own right. If I'm to make a story, especially a long-running story, I need to make sure that each individual story works well with a 3-act structure, with definitive character growth, so that people can enjoy it by its own merit. If the Marvel Cinematic Universe is going where I think it's going to be a convoluted mess. And they're going to be introducing characters like Blade, the violent vampire, and they're going to have difficulties with age ratings. You brought this on yourself, Marvel. And if any Marvel staff members happens to be watching this, please, at this point, please don't feel pressured into trying to milk this Marvel Cinematic Universe. You've already given us enough with Endgame. And it may be that you're trying to do the same thing again, but with less mistakes. But if you're going to do that without making new stories, you're already at a disadvantage of losing this sort of primal engagement of what's going to happen. How are these characters going to overcome the odds? I know these stories will have a bit of variety in between, but if you cut out the nuances, then all you're doing is telling the same story. Of course, this can go both ways, saying, oh, we are telling the same story, but we're making it new and interesting. Again, I could be wrong. I'm taking sort of an unbiased opinion. I'm just showing concerns, that's all. And one last thing before I end off this video. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is promising more diversity. I can respect what they're trying to do, but I fear that this is going to be somewhat forced into the storytelling. If I were to make a story, I'll treat people as people. Films like Pixar's Soul and the Studio Ghibli movies understand this. Though I've noticed that some characters hold on to these particular philosophies that in the Western world has been watered down and westernized to appeal to a mass market. In the West, of course, people are going to latch on to these characters with these different philosophies. But people in other locations where certain philosophies originate are probably not going to be happy with the way they're represented in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In the Western world, where these philosophies are watered down and arguably whitewashed, of course people are going to latch onto these characters for the sake of diversity. But in other places, particularly with extremist people, they're gonna feel backstabbed by the misrepresentation of certain philosophies. I'm keeping it vague as possible as not to offend anybody. But here's what I will say. I encourage you to look into these philosophies yourselves. And don't just assume that the media has it all covered. The media has been misrepresentative in the past. Why would you think they'd be representative now? Anyway, that's pretty much words are not working from mouth. I think that should summarize my initial problem with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I fear it's going to drive itself to a place where it'll be all dry. But again, I could be wrong. And thinking about it now, maybe there's a part of me that wants to be wrong, because the Marvel Cinematic Universe has been fantastic in the past. But to summarize everything I said, are these next stories worth telling? Because I, Callum, will now do sing, that I may get tired of the same old thing. Oh, somewhere deep inside of these bones, I feel Hollywood will make me a crone. Marvel might get repetitious through the years as I sit there with empty tears. Snow Woman, you understand my pain, right? Oh, don't give me the cold treatment now, woman. Please, give me comfort. She's watching you, Marvel. She's watching you. Her spirit will ascend. Her essence will go back to the clouds. Evaporation. She gonna rain on y'all parade.